get it down! I'm not gonna tell you again!
Can you first tell me what this is even about? Why are you here?
We got a call about a disturbance. You need to step outside and put your hands behind your back.
A disturbance? Sir, I'm a doctor. I just worked a double shift at the hospital. I've been asleep for 2
last
hours.
warning. Open this door. You're getting arrested.
Hey lovelies, welcome back to Justice Cam Chronicles. Before we continue, hit like, subscribe for more true crime stories, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We read every one. Now, let's get into the story.
The doorbell camera was recording everything. Every aggressive demand. Every violation of protocol. Every word that would cost Officer Bradley Mitchell his badge, his pension, and his freedom. He had no idea that the exhausted woman on the other side of the door had just finished saving 3 lives in the ICU. He had no idea she was a combat veteran with a Bronze Star. And he definitely had no idea she was about to end his career without even getting out of her pajamas. At exactly 11:28 p.m. on a Thursday night in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, what should have been another late-night visit to a woman living alone turned into the moment a serial predator's entire world came crashing down. This wasn't just another case of police misconduct caught on camera. This was an ER trauma physician with 15 years of experience, a woman who had treated gunshot wounds under fire in Iraq, a forensic examiner who had testified in court dozens of times, going up against an officer who had spent 3 years hunting women through police databases and thought he could intimidate his way through anything. What happened next would expose a pattern of assaults that had been hiding in plain sight. It would reveal that 3 other women had already tried to stop him, but couldn't prove what he had done. It would show how 1 doorbell camera, 1 audio recording, and 1 woman who knew exactly what questions to ask could bring down an 11-year police career and put a predator behind bars for nearly 4 decades. But in that moment, standing in her pajamas on the other side of a locked door, while someone with a gun and a badge counted down from 5, Danielle Moore didn't know any of that yet. She just knew something was very, very wrong. Danielle Moore looked exhausted because she was exhausted. 43 years old, 15 years in emergency medicine, and she had just clocked out from a 16-hour shift that should have ended at 7 but ran until past 9 because 2 trauma cases came in right at shift change. The kind of shift where you don't sit down once, where you're coordinating between 5 doctors while keeping someone alive with failing organs, where you're teaching residents how to place a central line while also managing a patient coding in the next bed. The first trauma had been a motorcycle accident. 22-year-old kid who thought he was invincible, wasn't wearing a helmet. Head injury, massive internal bleeding. They had him in surgery within 8 minutes, but he coded twice on the table. Danielle had been the one calling compressions, watching the monitors, making split-second decisions about medications and interventions. They got him back both times. He was in the ICU now, critical but alive. Whether he'd wake up, whether he'd be the same person when he did, those were questions for tomorrow. The second trauma came in while the first was still in surgery. Domestic violence call. Woman in her 30s. Multiple stab wounds. Her boyfriend had gone after her with a kitchen knife. 7 stab wounds. 1 punctured her lung. 1 nicked her liver. 1 came within millimeters of her heart. The woman had stayed conscious the whole time. Kept asking if her kids were okay. Kept saying she should have left him years ago. Kept apologizing to the doctors for bleeding on them like any of that mattered when you're trying to keep someone from dying on a gurney. That's the kind of shift that stays with you. Not because it's unusual. In a level 1 trauma center in Seattle, that's just Thursday. But because you see humanity at its most vulnerable. You see people making decisions that cost them everything. You see the consequences of violence and stupidity and bad luck, and sometimes just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Seattle Grace Medical Center is one of the busiest trauma centers on the West Coast. They see everything. Gunshot wounds from gang violence, stabbings from domestic disputes, car accidents where entire families come through the doors and you have to decide who gets the trauma bay and who waits. Drug overdoses where you're doing chest compressions while simultaneously administering Narcan and trying to get a line in veins that have collapsed from years of abuse. Suicide attempts where you're saving someone's life who didn't want to be saved. Danielle had seen all of it, and she had learned to compartmentalize it. To go home, take a shower, eat something, and sleep. To not think about the 19-year-old kid with a bullet in his chest who coded 3 times before they finally lost him. To not think about the woman who came in after her boyfriend beat her so badly her own mother didn't recognize her. To not think about any of it until the next shift when she'd walk back through those doors and do it all over again. But compartmentalization is a skill you develop over years. It's not natural. It's not easy. And some shifts break through those walls no matter how good you are at building them. Danielle's background made her particularly good at staying calm under pressure. Before medical school, she had served as a military physician in the Army, commissioned as an officer at 25 after completing medical school, deployed to Iraq twice as a combat surgeon. First deployment was 2004, right after the invasion, when everything was chaos and the wounded kept coming, and you learned to work through mortar fire and perform emergency surgeries while bullets were still flying. She had treated soldiers who had been hit by IEDs, had performed field surgeries with limited supplies, had made decisions about who could wait and who needed immediate intervention when you had 6 wounded and only 1 operating table, had watched soldiers die despite everything she did right, because sometimes the injuries are just too severe and the bleeding is too fast and there's nothing anyone can do. She earned a Bronze Star for treating 4 wounded soldiers under direct enemy fire during an ambush in Fallujah. Earned a Purple Heart when shrapnel from a mortar round caught her in the shoulder while she was performing surgery on a critical patient. She finished the surgery before letting anyone treat her wound. That's who Danielle Moore was. Someone who ran toward danger when everyone else was running away. Someone who made life or death decisions in fractions of a second. Someone who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and kept showing up anyway, because people needed help and she knew how to give it. After her second deployment, she completed a residency in emergency medicine, specializing in trauma care. She worked at a VA hospital during her residency, got fully board certified, and immediately started working at Seattle Grace Medical Center because that's where her skills translated best. Fast-paced, high pressure, life and death, no time for hesitation. 3 years into her ER career, she specialized further, becoming a forensic physician examiner. That meant training in sexual assault examinations, evidence collection, documentation procedures, and court testimony. She worked with police departments and prosecutor offices. She learned how law enforcement investigations worked, how evidence needed to be collected and documented, how to preserve chain of custody, how to present medical findings to juries in ways they could understand. She had testified in court 37 times. Rape cases mostly, domestic violence cases, child abuse cases. She learned how defense attorneys try to discredit medical evidence, how they try to create reasonable doubt, how important it is to document everything, to photograph everything, to maintain meticulous records because one small gap in documentation can destroy an entire case. That experience taught her about police procedures, about how law enforcement is supposed to operate, about the difference between legitimate police contact and something else, about when officers are following protocol and when they're not. That experience would save her life. That's what she was trying to do on this particular Thursday night in November. Just sleep. Just get a few hours before her brain started replaying the shift, before the adrenaline wore off completely and left her hollow and shaking. She had gotten home at 9:15, walked up 3 flights of stairs to apartment 312 because the elevator was broken again, unlocked her door, dropped her bag, walked straight to the bathroom, and stood under hot water for 20 minutes. Then she ate leftover pasta straight from the container while standing at her kitchen counter because sitting down felt like too much effort. She brushed her teeth, set an alarm for tomorrow, and collapsed into bed at 9:45. The kind of sleep that comes from complete physical and mental exhaustion. The kind where your body just shuts down. No dreams, no movement, just darkness, until the pounding started. Boom, boom, boom. Danielle's eyes snapped open. Her heart was already racing before her brain caught up to what was happening. Combat training doesn't leave you. Even 15 years later, even after you've traded a rifle for a stethoscope, your body remembers. She looked at her phone. 11:28 p.m. She had been asleep for 1 hour and 43 minutes. The pounding continued. Louder, more aggressive. The kind of pounding that says, I don't care if you're asleep. I don't care what you're doing. Open this door now. Boom, boom, boom. Police. Open the door. Danielle's mind shifted into assessment mode. The same mode that kicks in when someone comes into the ER with their intestines hanging out and everyone's panicking, but you need to be the one who stays calm. What are we dealing with? What are the facts? Fact 1. She had been asleep. Alone. In silence. Fact 2. She had just gotten home from work. She hadn't done anything. Hadn't had visitors. Hadn't made noise. Hadn't had any interaction with anyone except the cashier at the bodega where she bought the pasta 3 days ago. Fact 3. Wrong apartment calls happen. But police don't usually lead with that kind of aggression for a wrong apartment. Fact 4. Something about this felt wrong. She got out of bed, still in her pajamas. A simple gray t-shirt and cotton pants. Her phone in her hand. She walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. One officer. Male. White. Looked like he was in his 30s. Average build. Full Seattle PD uniform. But his body language was wrong. Weight forward. Shoulders tense. One hand near his weapon. The other hand raised to pound on the door again. He didn't look like someone responding to a noise complaint. He looked like someone hunting. Danielle had worked enough domestic violence cases to recognize that posture. The coiled tension. The barely controlled aggression. She had seen it in abusive partners who showed up at the hospital trying to get to their victims. She had seen it in the men who got arrested after putting their girlfriends in the ICU and then tried to finish the job when they found out where the girlfriend was being treated. That posture meant danger. It meant someone who was operating on emotion rather than protocol. Someone who had already decided how this was going to go and wasn't interested in de-escalation or conversation. Everything about this felt wrong. Police officers responding to legitimate calls don't lead with aggression like this. They identify themselves. They explain why they're there. They ask questions. They try to understand the situation before making demands. This officer had done none of that. He had just started pounding and threatening. Danielle's mind was already running through possibilities. Wrong apartment was still possible. Maybe he was supposed to be at 312 in another building. Maybe there was a legitimate emergency somewhere else, and he was confused about the location. But if it was a wrong apartment, why wouldn't he just check his notes when she asked? Why wouldn't he verify the address? Why the immediate escalation? Another possibility. Maybe there was a real disturbance call and dispatch had given him the wrong information. Technology fails. Mistakes happen. Maybe someone in the building had called about a noise complaint and dispatch sent him to the wrong apartment number. But again, if that was the case, why not just explain that? Why not say, we got a call about apartment 312, loud music, just need to verify everything's okay? Why the threats? The third possibility, the one that was making her pulse quicken and her training kick in, was that this wasn't a legitimate police contact at all. That this officer was here for reasons that had nothing to do with his job. Danielle didn't want to believe that. She had worked alongside good cops for years, had seen them put their lives on the line, had watched them show up at horrific crime scenes and maintain composure and treat victims with compassion. But she had also worked enough sexual assault cases to know that predators exist everywhere, in every profession, behind every kind of uniform and title. She had treated victims who had been assaulted by doctors, lawyers, teachers, coaches, priests, and yes, police officers. She had learned that you can't tell by looking at someone. That charm and authority in professional success don't mean someone isn't dangerous. That sometimes the people society trusts most are the ones who use that trust as a weapon. She didn't open the door. She didn't open the door. "What's this about?" she called through the door. The officer's response came immediately. Aggressive. No introduction. No badge number. No explanation. "Open this door right now, or I'm breaking it down." Danielle felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. "Can you tell me what this is about first? We got a call about a disturbance. You need to step outside." A disturbance. Danielle's mind ran through the timeline. She had been asleep. Her apartment had been silent. No TV. No music. No guests. The most noise she had made was running the shower an hour and a half ago. She had been too exhausted to even talk on the phone to her sister like she usually did after bad shifts. "What disturbance?" she called through the door. "I'm a doctor. I just worked a double shift. I've been asleep for 2 hours. Mom, last warning. Open up or you're getting arrested." This is the moment where most people would have opened the door. Because we're conditioned to obey authority. Because the uniform means something. Because the voice carries weight. Because the threat of arrest is terrifying even when you haven't done anything wrong. Most people would have opened that door. Danielle wasn't most people. She had testified in court enough times to know that police need probable cause. She had worked with enough prosecutors to understand what constitutes a legitimate welfare check versus what doesn't. She had treated enough victims of abuse by people in positions of power to know that a badge doesn't automatically mean safety. And something about this whole situation was wrong. "Officer, I'm not opening my door without knowing what this is about. What disturbance? Who called? What apartment number did they report?" Silence. Then the sound of the officer's radio. Static. A voice she couldn't make out. The officer responding in a low tone she couldn't hear clearly through the door. Danielle made a decision. She grabbed her phone and opened 3 things in rapid succession. First, voice memo app. Started recording. Second, Ring doorbell camera app. She had installed it 6 months ago because packages kept getting stolen from the hallway. She had honestly forgotten it was even there until this exact moment. The live feed loaded. Crystal clear video. Officer Bradley Mitchell standing right outside her door. His face fully visible. His aggressive posture unmistakable. Every word about to be captured. Third, text message to her neighbor across the hall. Ryan, an attorney. They weren't close friends, but they were friendly. Borrowed eggs kind of neighbors. Police at my door. Very aggressive. Claiming disturbance call. I was asleep. Recording everything on doorbell cam. Can you hear this? The reply came in seconds. I hear him. He's shouting. My doorbell camera sees him too. Recording. Be careful. Ryan had a doorbell camera too. Different angle, which meant 2 cameras. 2 angles. Full coverage. The officer pounded on the door again. Boom. 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 Open this door now. Danielle kept her voice calm, projecting toward the door so her phone recording would capture it clearly. So the doorbell camera would capture it. So there would be no question later about what was said. Officer, I'm happy to cooperate, but I need to understand what's happening. Can you tell me your name and badge number? You don't need my badge number. You need to open this door. Actually, Washington state law says I have the right to know who's making contact with me. Can you please identify yourself? The officer's voice changed. Quieter. More threatening. The kind of quiet that's more dangerous than shouting. Ma'am, if you don't open this door in 5 seconds, I'm going to assume you're destroying evidence, and I'm coming in. Evidence? Of what? Danielle had been asleep. She was a doctor. She had literally spent the last 16 hours saving lives. What evidence could she possibly be destroying? Evidence of what? I was asleep. I'm a physician at Seattle Grace. I just got home from a 16-hour shift. There's no disturbance here. 5. Her heart was pounding now, because this was real. This was happening. An armed man with legal authority was counting down outside her door and she didn't know why. 4. But she also knew something he didn't know. She knew that everything was being recorded. Video, audio, timestamp, everything. 3. She made another decision. She called 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. Professional. Calm. 911. What's your emergency? This is Danielle Moore at the Meridian Apartments on East Pine Street, apartment 312. There's a police officer at my door threatening to break it down. He says there was a disturbance call, but he won't explain what it's about. I was asleep. I'm asking for his badge number, and he's refusing. Can you verify this call and tell me what's happening? Through the door, the counting stopped. The officer must have heard her. Must have realized she was on the phone with dispatch. The 911 dispatcher sounded confused. Hold on, ma'am. 30 seconds of silence. Danielle could hear the officer's radio again. Crackling. Voices. He was talking to someone, but she couldn't make out the words. The dispatcher came back on. Ma'am, I'm not showing any disturbance calls to your address tonight. Can you describe the officer? Male. White. Looks like he's in his 30s. Average build. He's in full Seattle PD uniform. He's in the hallway outside my apartment right now. Ma'am, I'm going to connect you with a supervisor. Stay on the line. More silence, but different now. The energy on the other side of the door had changed. The officer wasn't pounding anymore. Wasn't shouting. The radio traffic was increasing. She could hear it even through the door. A new voice came on her phone. Older. Authority in the tone, but not aggression. This is Sergeant Williams with Seattle PD. Can you tell me what's going on? Danielle went through it all again. Every detail. The pounding at 11:28. The refusal to explain. The claim about a disturbance that dispatch says didn't happen. The demand for her to open the door. The refusal to give a badge number. The countdown. All of it. Sergeant Williams sounded genuinely concerned. Not the bureaucratic concern of someone covering for a colleague. Real concern. Ma'am, I need you to ask the officer for his last name and badge number again. I'm going to stay on the line. Danielle called through the door. Loud enough for her phone to capture. Loud enough for the doorbell camera. Loud enough for Ryan's camera across the hall. Officer, I have Seattle Police Sergeant Williams on the phone right now. He's asking for your identification. Long silence. Then the officer spoke, and his voice was completely different. Not aggressive, not threatening, uncertain, almost scared. This is Officer Bradley Mitchell. Badge number 7429. Danielle repeated it into her phone for the sergeant. What Sergeant Williams said next made her blood run cold. Miss Moore, Officer Mitchell is not assigned to your area tonight. He's not supposed to be in Capitol Hill at all. I'm sending units to your location right now. Do not open your door. Not for Officer Mitchell. Not for anyone. Until you see me personally. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Through the doorbell camera app, still open on her phone, Danielle watched Officer Bradley Mitchell walk away from her door. Fast. His face clearly visible. His body language completely changed. Shoulders hunched. Head down. The posture of someone who knows they just made a terrible mistake. What Danielle didn't know in that moment, standing in her pajamas with her phone in her hand and her heart still racing, was that she had just saved her own life. She didn't know that 3 other women had opened their doors for Officer Bradley Mitchell. She didn't know what happened to them after they let him inside. She didn't know that Mitchell had been using the police database to hunt women for 3 years. All she knew was that something had been very wrong, and she had trusted that feeling. Within 6 minutes, 3 police cars arrived. Danielle watched them on her doorbell camera feed. She saw Sergeant Williams and 4 other officers enter the building through the lobby camera feed that the Ring app also showed. There was a knock on her door. Professional, not aggressive. 2 sharp raps, and then a voice. Miss Moore, this is Sergeant Williams. I'm here with 3 other officers. Can you look through your peephole and verify it's us? She looked. 4 officers, all with name tags visible. Sergeant Williams was a black man in his 50s with gray at his temples. He held his badge up to the peephole. His face was serious but not threatening. She opened the door. Sergeant Williams looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the pajamas, the exhaustion in her eyes, the apartment behind her that was clearly the home of someone who had just come back from shift and gone straight to sleep. No music, no TV on, no guests, no evidence of any disturbance whatsoever. Miss Moore, I apologize for what just happened. Can you tell me everything from the beginning? Danielle walked them through it, but this time she had evidence to go with the words. She showed them her phone with the audio recording. She played it from the beginning, her voice calm and questioning, Mitchell's voice aggressive and threatening. The countdown, the call to 911, all of it time-stamped. Then she opened her Ring app and showed them the doorbell camera footage. Crystal clear video of Officer Bradley Mitchell at her door. His face fully visible. His aggressive body language. His hand near his weapon. Every moment captured. One of the officers with Sergeant Williams, a younger woman, watched the video and shook her head slowly. Oh, Bradley, what did you do? Danielle looked at her. You know him? The officer didn't answer. Just looked at Sergeant Williams. Then Ryan opened his door across the hall, still in his hoodie and sweatpants. Phone in hand. I got on my doorbell camera too. Different angle. Audio and video. The officer never identified himself properly. He made threats. He was aggressive from the start. And I can tell you for a fact there was no disturbance. I was home all evening working. This hallway was silent until he started pounding on Danielle's door. Sergeant Williams took both their contact information. He looked troubled, not the look of someone dealing with a minor incident. The look of someone who knows this is about to become a major problem. Miss Moore, did Officer Mitchell say why he was here? Did he mention a specific complaint or caller? He said there was a disturbance call. But when I called dispatch, they said there was no call to this address. That's correct. There was no call. Sergeant Williams paused. I need to ask you something, and please be honest. Do you know Officer Mitchell? Have you had any prior contact with him? No. I've never seen him before tonight. Any disputes with neighbors? Any complaints filed against you? Anything that might explain why an officer would come to your door? Nothing. I work. I sleep. I'm barely home. I've lived here 7 years without any problems. Sergeant Williams nodded slowly. Then he said something that made the whole situation crystallize. Miss Moore, I'm going to be direct with you. This is very serious. An officer who's not assigned to this area showed up at your door with no call for service, refused to properly identify himself, and made threats to force entry. That's not police procedure. That's not legal. Something is very wrong here. He paused, made eye contact, made sure she understood what he was about to say. I'm very glad you didn't open that door. The way he said it, the weight in those words. Danielle felt something cold settle in her stomach. What do you mean? I can't say more right now. But I want to know you did everything right tonight. You stayed calm. You asked questions. You documented everything. You called 911. You protected yourself without escalating. A lot of people would have opened that door. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Sergeant Williams gave her his card. He told her someone from Internal Affairs would contact her within 24 hours. He asked her to download the doorbell camera footage and the audio recording and send it to the email address on his card. He made sure her door locked properly. He made sure she had his direct cell phone number. He told her to call him immediately if Mitchell or anyone else came back. Then the officers left. Danielle locked her door, checked every window, checked the doorbell camera app to make sure it was still recording. And she didn't sleep for the rest of the night. What Sergeant Williams didn't tell Danielle that night was that Officer Bradley Mitchell had been under quiet investigation for 6 months. That the department had received 3 anonymous complaints from women who claimed Mitchell had shown up at their homes late at night. Always alone. Always when they were home alone. Always with vague claims about disturbance calls that dispatch had no record of. But the women had been too scared to make formal complaints. They gave statements anonymously through victim advocates. They described what happened, but refused to go on record. Without victims willing to testify, without physical evidence, without any documentation, Internal Affairs couldn't move forward with charges. They had been watching Mitchell, reviewing his patrol logs when they could, looking for patterns. But they needed something concrete. They needed evidence. Danielle Moore had just given them evidence. Audio recording. Video showing Mitchell's face clearly. A witness in Ryan. A 911 call proving there was no disturbance. Everything documented and time-stamped and absolutely impossible to dispute. The next morning, a detective called, but not from Internal Affairs, from the Sexual Assault and Child Abuse Unit. That's when Danielle learned the full story. The detective's name was Sarah Chun. 20 years in SVU. She had seen everything. She had heard every excuse. She had watched guilty men walk free because there wasn't enough evidence. She had held the hands of victims who were too traumatized to testify. She sounded tired when she called, but there was something else in her voice. Something like hope. Miss Moore, my name is Detective Chun with the Sexual Assault and Child Abuse Unit. I need to talk to you about what happened last night. Are you somewhere you could talk privately? Danielle was at home. Still hadn't gone to sleep. Had called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years because she couldn't imagine walking into the ER after what happened. I'm home. I'm alone. What's this about? Detective Chun took a breath. 6 months ago, a woman reported that she was sexually assaulted by a police officer who came to her apartment late at night, claiming there was a disturbance call. She let him in. He assaulted her. She reported it immediately, but she couldn't identify which officer it was. She was too traumatized to remember his face clearly, and he had kept his badge turned away from her. Danielle felt her stomach drop. Then 2 more women came forward with similar stories. Late-night visits, claims of disturbance calls, forced entry, assaults. But again, the women couldn't positively identify the officer. They gave physical descriptions, but nothing concrete enough to make an arrest. Detective Chun continued, "We've been working with Internal Affairs to identify potential suspects based on patrol patterns and shift schedules. We narrowed it down to 3 officers. Bradley Mitchell was one of them. But we didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest or even to get a warrant for his patrol records." A pause. "Miss Moore, you gave us that evidence. Mitchell came to your apartment with no call for service. He tried a force entry. He refused to identify himself. And it's all documented on your doorbell camera with his face clearly visible. That's enough for a warrant." Danielle's training kicked in. The same analytical mode that helps her prioritize patients in the ER. "You said 3 women. Do they know about last night?" "Not yet. But if you're willing to make a formal statement and potentially testify, we can use your evidence to get warrants for Mitchell's patrol car computer, his personal phone, his home computer. If he's been doing what we think he's been doing, there'll be more evidence." "What do you think he's been doing?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I think he's been using the police database to identify women who live alone. I think he's been visiting them late at night when they're vulnerable. I think he's been using his badge and his authority to gain entry. And I think what happened to you last night was the beginning of a pattern that you stopped by keeping your door closed." Danielle felt cold. "What happens to the women who open their doors?" "That's what we're trying to find out. I'll testify. I'll do whatever you need. Just tell me what to do." Within 48 hours, the department had enough for a warrant. Mitchell's patrol car computer, his personal phone, his home computer, his locker at the station, everything. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Mitchell had been using the police database to search for women, specifically women who lived alone. He would run names and addresses through the system, looking for single female residents between the ages of 25 and 45. Women who lived in apartments without doormen or heavy security. Women who worked night shifts or irregular hours. Women who were likely to be home alone late at night. The database logs went back 3 years. Hundreds of searches, most of them during his off-duty hours. Most of them women who lived outside his patrol area. Most of them women he had no legitimate law enforcement reason to be looking up. His patrol car GPS showed he had visited dozens of these addresses. Always late at night. Always when he wasn't on duty. Always in neighborhoods he wasn't assigned to. On his personal phone, they found photos. Women through windows. Women walking to their cars. Women entering apartment buildings. Notes about their schedules. When they came home. When they left. Whether they had roommates. Whether they had boyfriends. And then they found the videos. Mitchell had been wearing a hidden camera during some of his late-night visits. He had recorded himself assaulting women. The videos were date-stamped. Location-stamped. There was no question about what was happening. No question about consent. No question about who the perpetrator was. 3 women. 3 separate incidents. 3 assaults that were documented in graphic detail on Mitchell's own camera. The prosecutors couldn't believe what they were seeing. Officers who had been in law enforcement for decades said they had never seen evidence this clear, this damning, this impossible to dispute. Bradley Mitchell was arrested at his home on a Monday morning. 6 a.m. 3 patrol cars. 5 officers. They found him in his bedroom, still asleep. They woke him up with guns drawn because they didn't know if he would fight. They didn't know if he would try to destroy evidence. They didn't know what he was capable of. Mitchell was charged with 3 counts of rape in the first degree, 5 counts of burglary with sexual motivation, 8 counts of stalking, multiple counts of official misconduct, multiple counts of abuse of authority, computer crimes for the database searches, illegal surveillance for the hidden camera videos. The bail hearing was standing room only. The prosecutor argued that Mitchell was a flight risk and a danger to the community, that he had used his position as a police officer to identify and assault vulnerable women, that he had been doing this for at least 3 years, and there were likely more victims who hadn't come forward yet. The defense attorney argued that Mitchell had no prior criminal record, that he had been a Seattle police officer for 11 years, that he had a family and ties to the community. The judge set bail at $2 million and ordered Mitchell to surrender his passport and be fitted with an electronic monitoring device if he made bail. He didn't make bail. The case made national news. Not just local. National. Because it had everything. A police officer using his badge to hunt women. 3 years of documented predatory behavior. Victims who had tried to report but couldn't prove what happened. And one doctor who had the presence of mind to document everything and stop him before he could add another name to his list. The news coverage focused on the doorbell camera footage. It was shown on every channel. Danielle's face was blurred, but you could hear her voice. Calm, rational, asking questions, knowing her rights. The contrast with Mitchell's aggressive demands was stark. Legal experts weighed in. Civil rights attorneys talked about how important it is to know your rights when police come to your door. Security companies saw a spike in doorbell camera sales. Police departments around the country started reviewing their policies on officer database access and late-night wellness checks. But Danielle didn't do any interviews. She went back to work. She told the hospital administration what happened. They offered her time off. She declined. She told them she just wanted to work, that the ER was where she made sense of things, that saving lives was how she processed trauma. Her coworkers knew. Everyone knew. The story was everywhere. But they didn't ask her about it. They just worked alongside her. Let her do her job. Let her be normal. The only time anyone mentioned it was when one of the other doctors, an older woman named Patricia, who had been in emergency medicine for 30 years, pulled her aside during a break. You saved those women's lives. You know that, right? The ones he already hurt and the ones he was planning to hurt. You saved them. Danielle nodded. Didn't trust herself to speak. And you saved yourself. That's the part one want you to remember. You didn't freeze. You didn't comply just because he had a badge. You trusted your gut and you protected yourself. That takes courage. The criminal trial took 8 months to get to court. The prosecutor's office took their time building the case. They wanted it airtight. They wanted every piece of evidence documented and verified. They wanted no possibility of appeal based on procedural errors. During those 8 months, 2 more women came forward. They had seen the news coverage. They had recognized Mitchell from the doorbell camera footage. They had been too scared to report before, but seeing other victims come forward gave them courage. Both women had similar stories. Late-night visits, claims of disturbance calls, Mitchell forcing his way into their apartments, assaults that left them traumatized and terrified. Both women had reported the incidents at the time, but without being able to identify the officer, the cases had gone nowhere. Now they could identify him. Now there was corroborating evidence. Now the prosecutor added 2 more counts of rape to the charges. Mitchell's defense attorney tried everything. Tried to get the doorbell camera footage excluded. Argued it was obtained without a warrant. The judge denied it. The footage was from Danielle's private property, capturing what happened in a public hallway. Tried to get the database searches excluded. Argued they were part of Mitchell's legitimate police work. The prosecution brought in database experts who testified that none of the searches were connected to active cases, that they were all done during off-duty hours, that there was no legitimate law enforcement purpose for any of them. The judge allowed them as evidence. Tried to get the hidden camera videos excluded. Argued chain of custody issues. The prosecution had documentation showing the videos were found on Mitchell's personal phone during a legitimate search based on probable cause from Danielle's doorbell footage and the database evidence. The judge allowed them. By the time the trial started, Mitchell's defense was essentially destroyed before opening statements. The trial lasted 9 days. The courtroom was packed every single day. Media, victims' advocates, police officers, both in support of the victims and in disbelief that one of their own could do this. Mitchell's family in the back row looking devastated. The prosecution called Danielle on day 3. She wore simple professional clothes. No muck-up, hair pulled back. She looked exactly like what she was, a doctor who worked too many hours and had accidentally become a key witness in a major criminal case. The prosecutor walked her through that night. Every detail. The audio recording was played in court. Her voice asking calm questions. Mitchell's voice making threats. The countdown. The call to 911. Then they showed the doorbell camera footage. The jury watched Mitchell pound on Danielle's door. Watched his aggressive posture. Watched him refuse to identify himself. Watched his demeanor change completely when Danielle said she had a sergeant on the phone. The defense attorney tried to cross-examine. Tried to suggest Danielle had been uncooperative, that a reasonable person would have just opened the door for a police officer. Danielle didn't take the bait. She stayed calm, used her years of testifying in court to answer clearly and factually. I asked multiple times what the call was about. I asked for his name and badge number. I offered to cooperate once I understood what was happening. That seems reasonable to me. But you didn't open the door when he identified himself as police. He didn't identify himself. He said he was police, but refused to give his name or badge number. He refused to explain what the call was about. When I called 911 to verify, dispatch told me there was no call to my address. That told me something was wrong. You didn't trust the police officer at your door? I didn't trust the situation, and I was right not to. The defense attorney didn't ask any more questions. The 3 assault victims testified. Their testimony was devastating. Detailed accounts of what Mitchell had done, how he had used his badge to gain entry, how he had threatened them, how he had assaulted them, how he had told them no one would believe them if they reported. One of the victims, a woman named Jennifer, broke down on the stand. He told me I should feel lucky a cop was paying attention to me, that I was nothing, that if I reported him, he would make sure I regretted it. The database expert testified about the hundreds of searches Mitchell had conducted, showed the jury the pattern. Young women, living alone, no doorman, no security, all outside his patrol area, all during off-duty hours. The digital forensics expert testified about the hidden camera videos, about the dates and timestamps, about the metadata that proved they were recorded by Mitchell's device. The videos themselves were shown to the jury in a closed session. Several jurors were crying when they came back into the courtroom. The defense called character witnesses. Mitchell's former training officer who said he had been a good cop. Former partners who said they had never seen any warning signs. His wife who testified that he was a good father and husband. But the prosecution brought in experts who testified about how predators often maintain normal facades, how they compartmentalize their behavior, how someone could be a good father and husband while also being a serial rapist. The closing arguments took most of day 8. The prosecution methodically went through every piece of evidence. The doorbell camera footage proving Mitchell's pattern of behavior. The database searches proving premeditation. The hidden camera videos proving the assaults. The victim testimony proving the pattern. The defense argued that Mitchell had made mistakes, but that the prosecution hadn't proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt. That the database searches could have been for legitimate purposes. That the encounters with the victims were consensual. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. 3 counts of rape in the first degree. 5 counts of burglary with sexual motivation. 8 counts of stalking. All the misconduct charges. All the computer crimes. Mitchell showed no emotion. Just sat there. His wife in the back of the courtroom sobbed. The judge set a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks later. At the sentencing, all 5 victims gave impact statements. They talked about the trauma, the fear, the violation of having someone they were supposed to trust attack them in their own homes. They talked about therapy and nightmares and being afraid to be alone. They talked about how it felt to know that a police officer, someone who was supposed to protect them, had instead hunted them. Jennifer's statement was the most powerful. He took away my sense of safety. He made me afraid of the people who were supposed to protect us. He made me question whether I could ever trust anyone again. And he did it wearing a badge. He did it using the authority we give to police officers. That makes it worse. That makes it unforgivable. The prosecutor recommended 60 years, the maximum allowed under the sentencing guidelines. The defense asked for leniency, argued that Mitchell had no prior record, that he had a family, that he had served the community for 11 years. The judge took 20 minutes to deliver his decision. Mr. Mitchell, you were given a badge and a gun and the authority to protect the citizens of Seattle. You took an oath to serve and protect. Instead, you used your position to identify vulnerable women. You used your badge to gain access to their homes. You used your authority to assault them. You used your position to intimidate them into silence. The judge paused, looked directly at Mitchell. You didn't just violate these women. You violated the trust that communities need to have in law enforcement. You made it harder for every good officer to do their job. You made victims less likely to report crimes. You damaged the relationship between police and the public in ways that will take years to repair. Another pause. The law allows me to sentence you to 60 years. I'm going to impose a sentence of 38 years. You will serve at least 25 years before you are eligible for parole. This is not a sentence I impose lightly, but the severity of your crimes, the abuse of your position, and the number of victims demands it. Mitchell was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He would be 68 years old before he was even eligible for parole. Based on the nature of his crimes and the abuse of authority, it was unlikely he would ever be released. But Danielle wasn't done. The criminal trial was over, but the civil case was just beginning. She filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Seattle Police Department. Not for money, though there would be money. For accountability. Her lawsuit alleged that the department had failed to properly investigate the earlier complaints against Mitchell, that they had allowed him to continue patrolling while under investigation, that their policies for handling sexual assault allegations against officers were inadequate, that they had failed to protect the public. The lawsuit was 68 pages long. It included expert testimony from law enforcement professionals who reviewed the department's handling of the Mitchell case. It included testimony from the 3 women who had filed anonymous complaints before Danielle's incident. It included analysis of database access logs showing that Mitchell's searches should have raised red flags much earlier. The city tried to fight it. They argued that they had been investigating Mitchell, that they had followed proper procedures, that they couldn't have known he was a predator without evidence. Danielle's attorney destroyed those arguments systematically. She showed that 3 women had come forward with nearly identical stories months before Danielle's incident. She showed that the department had done minimal follow-up, had never tried to match the physical descriptions to specific officers, had never checked database access logs until after Mitchell's arrest. She showed that Mitchell's database searches had been logged the entire time, that his GPS logs showed him visiting addresses outside his patrol area during off-duty hours, that all of this information was available to supervisors if anyone had bothered to look. She showed that the department's own policies required more aggressive investigation of sexual assault allegations against officers, that those policies had been ignored. The trial lasted 9 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found in Danielle's favor on every count. They awarded her $575,000 in damages. More importantly, the judge ordered the Seattle Police Department to implement sweeping reforms. An independent review board specifically for sexual misconduct allegations, automatic flag systems in the database to identify officers searching for personal information without case-related reasons, mandatory body cameras during all public contact, including wellness checks and noise complaints, mandatory training on recognizing and reporting predatory behavior by fellow officers. The department agreed to all of it, not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. But the real story is what Danielle did with the money. She kept $50,000 to cover her legal expenses and time off work during the trial. The rest, $525,000, she donated. $200,000 went to the King County Sexual Assault Resource Center, which provides free counseling and support to survivors. $150,000 went to a legal aid organization that helps low-income people file civil rights lawsuits against police departments. And $175,000 went to start a grant program that pays for security systems, doorbell cameras, and safety equipment for women living alone in high-crime areas. Danielle gave interviews to local news stations. She was calm, articulate, focused on the bigger picture. She talked about documentation, about knowing your rights, about the courage of the other victims who came forward. She also talked about good police officers. She made it clear this wasn't about all police. She had worked with hundreds of officers during her years as a forensic physician. Most of them were good people doing difficult jobs. This was about one predator who abused his authority. This was about systems that failed to catch him. This was about accountability. The reforms worked. In the year following the Mitchell case, the Seattle Police Department flagged and investigated 7 officers for inappropriate database searches. 3 were fired. 2 resigned. 2 were given retraining and moved to positions without public contact. The independent review board handled 12 allegations of sexual misconduct by officers in its first year. 8 were substantiated. All 8 officers were fired or resigned. The body camera requirement led to 3 more cases where officers' own cameras captured them violating procedures during wellness checks. All 3 were disciplined. None resulted in criminal charges, but all resulted in policy changes. The department reached out to the 3 women who had filed anonymous complaints before Danielle's incident. They apologized. They offered to reopen the investigations with full support and resources. 2 of the women agreed to make formal statements, which led to additional charges being filed against Mitchell even after his criminal conviction. civil charges that gave him access to victim compensation funds and additional resources for therapy and support. Mitchell is currently serving his sentence at Washington State Penitentiary. He filed an appeal claiming the search of his computers was unconstitutional. The appeal was denied. He filed 2 more appeals, both denied. He'll be eligible for parole when he's 68 years old. It's unlikely he'll ever be released. Danielle continued working as an ER physician. She got promoted to a lead position in the trauma unit. She still works the same brutal shifts, still saves lives regularly. But now she also gives talks at police academies, medical schools, and community centers. She talks about documentation, about evidence collection, about knowing your rights. She shows the audio recording from that night, shows the doorbell camera footage, walks people through exactly what she did and why. Her message is always the same. Stay calm. Ask questions. Document everything. Don't be afraid to call 911 even if police are already there. Know your rights. Trust your instincts. The doorbell camera footage is still used in training. Law enforcement agencies across the country show it as an example of what happens when officers abuse their authority. Security companies use it in their marketing materials. Community organizations use it to teach people about their rights. Ryan, her neighbor across the hall, still lives there. They're good friends now. He jokes that he's her unofficial security guard, though Danielle points out that she's the one with combat experience. The Meridian Apartments encouraged all residents to install doorbell cameras after the incident. Jennifer, one of Mitchell's assault victims, approached Danielle after the sentencing. They had never met before. Jennifer hugged her and said something that Danielle still thinks about years later. You saved my life, not just because you stopped him from hurting more people, but because you showed me we could fight back, that we could win, that we didn't have to be afraid anymore. That's what this story is really about. Not just one doctor who kept her door closed, not just one predator who was caught, not just one department that was forced to change. It's about the power of documentation, the importance of trusting your instincts, the courage it takes to ask questions when someone with authority is demanding compliance, the difference between following orders and protecting yourself. Danielle wasn't trying to be a hero that night. She was just trying to sleep after a brutal shift. She was exhausted and confused and frankly just wanted to be left alone. But she trusted that something was wrong. She asked questions. She documented everything. She called 911 even though there was already a police officer at her door. And because she did all of that, because she stayed calm and made good decisions under pressure, she stopped a serial predator. She gave voice to victims who had been silenced. She forced systemic changes that protected countless other women. She showed that a badge doesn't mean automatic compliance, that authority has limits, that citizens have rights even when they're standing in their pajamas on the other side of a locked door at 11:30 at night. One doorbell camera, one audio recording, one 911 call, one neighbor who was recording too, one woman who knew enough about the law to ask the right questions. 11 years of a police career ended. 38 years of prison time. $575,000 in damages that went to organizations helping survivors. Department-wide policy changes that are still in effect today. 7 additional officers identified and investigated because of those policy changes. Countless women protected because one woman kept her door closed and documented everything. That's the power of knowing your rights. That's the importance of trusting your instincts. That's what happens when someone refuses to be intimidated, even by someone in uniform carrying a gun and a badge. Years later, in interviews and talks, Danielle is always asked the same question. What would you tell other people in that situation? What should they do if police come to their door late at night? Her answer never changes. Ask questions. Every time. You have the right to know who's at your door and why. You have the right to call 911 to verify. You have the right to refuse entry without a warrant unless there's an emergency. And document everything. Every phone has a voice recorder. Most people have doorbell cameras now. Use them, because if something goes wrong, that documentation might be the only thing that protects you. She pauses. And trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. I can't tell you it saved my life that night. The combat training that taught me to assess threats. The years working in emergency medicine that taught me to stay calm under pressure. The time I spent as a forensic physician learning about evidence and procedure. Maybe all of it. Maybe none of it. Maybe it was just instinct telling me that nothing about that situation was right. Another pause. But whatever it was, I listened to it. I didn't open that door. And that decision changed everything. The thing that haunts Danielle isn't what happened. It's what almost happened. What would have happened if she had opened that door? If she had complied with Mitchell's demands? If she had trusted the badge instead of trusting her instincts? She thinks about the 3 women who did open their doors, who did trust the badge, who did everything society tells us to do when police show up. She thinks about what happened to them, about the trauma they carry, about how long it took them to feel safe again. And she thinks about the women Mitchell was planning to visit next, the names in his database searches, the addresses he had GPS logged but hadn't visited yet, the pattern that was still escalating when Danielle's doorbell camera and 911 call stopped it. Those women don't know who they are. They don't know they were on Mitchell's list. They don't know how close they came to having their lives destroyed by a predator with a badge. They just went about their lives, went to work, came home, slept safely in their apartments, never knowing that a doctor they would never meet had saved them by keeping her door closed and trusting that something was wrong. That's the real power of what Danielle did. Not just the predator she stopped, not just the victims who got justice, but the unknown number of people who were protected because one person had the courage to ask questions and document everything and refuse to be intimidated. One decision, one closed door, one recording. Everything captured by a doorbell camera that cost $99 and had been installed to stop package thieves. Bradley Mitchell thought he was untouchable. He thought the badge protected him. He thought women would be too scared to report. He thought even if they did report, no one would believe them. He thought he could count down from 5 and someone would open the door out of fear. He was wrong. Danielle Moore wasn't afraid. She was exhausted and confused and probably should have been afraid. But instead, she was methodical. She asked questions. She documented everything. She called the one number that could verify whether Mitchell was supposed to be there. And when Sergeant Williams told her there was no call to her address, that Mitchell wasn't assigned to her area, that something was very wrong, she didn't panic. She just watched her doorbell camera as Mitchell walked away. His face clearly visible. His career already over. His freedom already counted in hours instead of years. Mitchell is 61 now. He'll be 68 before he's even eligible for parole. The parole board will review his case. They'll see the 3 assault victims, the 2 additional victims who came forward later, the hundreds of database searches, the hidden camera videos, the absolute absence of remorse or accountability. They'll deny parole. He'll die in prison. That's the most likely outcome. A police officer who used his badge to hunt women will spend the rest of his life surrounded by people who hate cops and hate rapists, who understand exactly what he did and what he is. That's justice. Not perfect justice, because the victims will carry their trauma forever, but justice nonetheless. Danielle doesn't think about Mitchell much anymore. She doesn't think about that night unless she's telling the story at a training session or an interview. She just goes to work, saves lives, comes home. Lives are life. But she never forgot the lesson. Authority doesn't mean compliance. A badge doesn't mean automatic trust. Questions aren't obstruction. Documentation isn't paranoia. And sometimes the most important decision you'll ever make is keeping a door closed and trusting that something is wrong even when you can't articulate exactly what or why. Because on the other side of that door might be someone who will destroy your life if you let them in. Or it might be nothing. A wrong address. a miscommunication, a mistake. But you won't know unless you ask questions, unless you verify, unless you protect yourself, even when someone with authority is demanding compliance. That's the lesson from one Thursday night in Seattle. From one exhausted doctor who just wanted to sleep. From one doorbell camera recording everything. From one woman who changed how an entire police department operates by simply refusing to open a door. The power isn't in the camera. It's in the decision to use it. The power isn't in the 911 call. It's in the courage to make it even when a police officer is already at your door. The power isn't in knowing your rights. It's in having the strength to assert them when asserting them might make things worse. Danielle had that strength, that clarity, that presence of mind. And because she did, a predator was stopped. Victims got justice. Systems were changed. Policies were reformed. And countless unknown women who will never know how close they came to being on Mitchell's list were protected. One closed door. That's all it took. One closed door and the courage to keep it that way. The investigation into Mitchell's activities revealed layers of deception that went far beyond what anyone initially suspected. When forensic analysts began reconstructing his digital footprint, they found a pattern of behavior that suggested planning and premeditation that stretched back years before his first confirmed assault. Mitchell's personal computer contained folders within folders, encrypted files that required digital forensics experts to crack. When they finally accessed the files, they found journals, detailed written accounts of his fantasies, plans for how to approach victims, analysis of his own past attempts, and what worked versus what didn't. In one journal entry from 18 months before Danielle's incident, Mitchell wrote about his methodology. He described it clinically, almost like a research project. He wrote about how he tested different approaches, tried showing up in uniform versus plain clothes, tried different times of night, tried different stories about why he was there. Disturbance calls worked best, he noted, because they were vague enough that women couldn't immediately disprove them. He wrote about his mistakes, times when women had been suspicious and he had to back off, times when neighbors had been present and ruined his plans, times when his timing was off and women had just left or were expected visitors soon. He wrote about his successes, the women who had let him in, what he said that convinced them, how he escalated once inside, how he threatened them afterward to ensure they wouldn't report. Reading those journal entries, investigators realized they were dealing with someone who had been treating this like a job, like something he worked at and refined over time. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't opportunistic. It was methodical predation. The journals also contained something else. A list, names and addresses of women Mitchell was planning to target in the future. 47 names. 47 women who had been identified, researched, surveilled, and added to what essentially was a hunting list. Danielle Moore's name was on that list. Number 32. Mitchell had been watching her for 6 weeks before he showed up at her door, had photos of her walking into her building after shifts, had notes about her schedule, had identified her as a healthcare worker who worked long hours and came home exhausted, had noted that she lived alone, had marked her as a target. The only thing he hadn't known was that Danielle Moore wasn't like the women who had opened their doors before. She had combat training, forensic experience, knowledge of police procedures, a doorbell camera, and the presence of mind to use all of it when it mattered most. Investigators contacted all 47 women on the list. Most had no idea they had been in danger. Some found it hard to believe. A few broke down when they learned how close they had come to becoming victims. 2 women on the list came forward with additional information. They said Mitchell had approached them before, but they had been suspicious and didn't let him in. One woman said he showed up at her apartment claiming to be investigating a burglary in the building. She told him to come back during the day when building management was available. He never came back. She thought nothing of it until she got the call from investigators. Another woman said Mitchell had stopped her on the street late at night, claiming her car had been reported in a hit-and-run. She knew her car had been parked all evening and told him there must be a mistake. He had asked for her address to verify her registration. She gave him a fake address. He seemed frustrated, but let her go. She later saw him drive past her real apartment building slowly, like he was looking for something. These women had trusted their instincts, had been suspicious of things that didn't add up, had protected themselves without even knowing that's what they were doing. The trial brought all of this evidence into public view. The database searches, the GPS logs, the photos, the notes, the journals, the victim list, every piece of it documented and presented to the jury in methodical detail. The prosecution built their case like a puzzle, each piece of evidence connected to the next. The database searches showed Mitchell identifying targets. The GPS logs showed him surveilling those targets. The photos showed him stalking those targets. The notes showed him planning his approaches. The journals showed his methodology and mindset. The recordings showed the actual assaults. The victim list showed his future plans. It was overwhelming. The defense had nothing to work with. They tried to argue that the database searches were for legitimate police work. But the prosecution brought in his supervisor, who testified that none of the addresses Mitchell searched were connected to any cases he was working, that there were no work orders, no dispatch calls, no legitimate reason for any of the searches. They tried to argue that the GPS logs could be explained by Mitchell just driving around during off-duty hours. But the prosecution showed that he consistently drove to the same addresses he had searched in the database, that he would park near those addresses for extended periods, that he returned to the same locations multiple times. They tried to argue that taking photos wasn't illegal, but the prosecution presented testimony from cybersecurity experts who explained that Mitchell was using zoom lenses to photograph women through their windows, that these were surveillance photos taken without consent, that they were combined with notes about the women's schedules and habits, that this was stalking behavior, pure and simple. They couldn't argue against the recordings. Their own client had filmed himself committing the assaults. There was no defense for that. They tried to get the recordings excluded on technical grounds. Argued chain of custody issues. The judge denied every motion. The recordings were found on Mitchell's phone during a legitimate search authorized by a warrant based on probable cause from Danielle's doorbell footage. By day 5 of the trial, it was clear the defense had no path to acquittal. Mitchell's attorney made a last-minute attempt to negotiate a plea deal, offered to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a lighter sentence. The prosecutor rejected it immediately. This case was going to trial. This case was going to verdict, because the evidence was too strong, because the victims deserved their day in court, because the public needed to see exactly what Mitchell had done and how he had used his badge to do it. The victim testimony was devastating, but also empowering. These were women who had been terrorized by someone they should have been able to trust, who had been assaulted in their own homes, who had been threatened into silence, who had lived with trauma for months or years while Mitchell continued to hunt. But now they were speaking in open court, with their assailant sitting 20 feet away, with the jury listening to every word, with the knowledge that this time they would be believed. This time there was evidence. This time justice was possible. The first victim to testify was a woman named Jennifer, 29 years old. She worked as a data analyst for a tech company, lived alone in a small apartment in Ballard. Mitchell had come to her door 9 months before Danielle's incident. Jennifer described opening the door because Mitchell said he was investigating a noise complaint, how he had been professional at first, how he asked to come inside to verify where the noise was coming from, how she let him in because why wouldn't you trust a police officer? She described how his demeanor changed once inside, how he closed the door behind him, how he asked if anyone else was home, how her stomach dropped when she realized she was alone with him and something was very wrong. She described trying to get him to leave. saying she needed to get to work early, saying her boyfriend would be home soon, lying desperately to try to make him leave. She described what happened when he didn't leave, when he backed her against the wall, when he told her that no one would believe her if she reported, when he reminded her that he was a police officer and she was nobody. Jennifer's voice broke multiple times during her testimony, but she kept going. She looked at the jury and told them that for months she blamed herself, thought she should have fought harder, should have screamed, should have done something different. But therapy helped her understand that she had been in an impossible situation, that Mitchell had used his authority and training to manipulate her, that he had chosen her specifically because she lived alone and would be vulnerable, that none of it was her fault. The second victim, Maria, was a graduate student, 26 years old. She lived in a studio apartment in Capitol Hill. Mitchell had come to her door 7 months before Danielle's incident. Maria's story was similar, but with chilling differences. Mitchell had told her there was a gas leak in the building and he needed to check her apartment for safety. She let him immediately because a gas leak sounded urgent and dangerous. He assaulted her while she was calling building management to verify the gas leak story, told her to hang up the phone, told her that if she didn't cooperate, he would arrest her for making a false report and interfering with an investigation. Maria described the cognitive dissonance, the confusion of being assaulted by someone wearing a police uniform, the fear that if she fought back, she would be arrested, the terror of not knowing if anyone would believe her afterward. She reported it immediately, went to the hospital, had a rape kit done, told the doctor what happened, told the police who took her statement, but she couldn't identify which officer it was. She had been too traumatized to look at his badge, too scared to remember his face clearly. The description she gave was too vague. Average height, average build, white male in his 30s. It could have been dozens of officers. Her case went nowhere. No detective followed up. No lineup was ever conducted. Her rape kit sat in storage until Mitchell's arrest when it was finally processed and the DNA matched. The third victim, Alexis, was a bartender, 33 years old, single mother of 2. Mitchell had come to her door 5 months before Danielle's incident. Alexis had a different response than the other women. When Mitchell started getting aggressive, she fought. She screamed. She managed to get to her phone and dial 911 before he grabbed it from her. Mitchell left, just walked out and disappeared. Alexis gave a full report to the responding officers, described the assault, described the officer who did it. But again, no badge number, no clear ID, just a description that could fit multiple officers. The responding officers filed the report, but it went into a database alongside thousands of other reports. No detective was assigned. No follow-up happened, because without a suspect, there was nowhere to go with the investigation. All 3 women had tried to report. All 3 had done everything they were supposed to do, and the system had failed all 3 of them. Not because the officers who took their reports didn't believe them, but because without a way to identify the perpetrator, the cases couldn't move forward. That's the insidious thing about Mitchell's method. He didn't target random strangers on the street where there might be witnesses or cameras. He went to their homes, private spaces, where there would be no witnesses, where would be his word against theirs, where a police officer's word would be believed over a victim's. And he made sure they couldn't identify him, kept his badge partially covered, positioned himself so they couldn't see his name tag clearly, made sure they were too scared or traumatized to focus on details that could be used to identify him later. It was calculated, all of it, every detail planned to minimize the chance he would be caught. But Danielle's doorbell camera changed everything, because for the first time, there was a clear image of Mitchell's face, clear audio of his voice, clear documentation of his methods and his lies, clear proof that he was showing up at apartments with no legitimate police reason. And once investigators had that proof, everything else fell into place. The database searches that had seemed random were suddenly a pattern. The GPS logs that showed him driving to different neighborhoods were suddenly evidence of stalking. The photos on his phone were suddenly surveillance evidence. The 3 women who had reported being assaulted by an unidentified officer suddenly could make a positive ID. Danielle didn't just save herself. She gave voice to 3 women who had been telling the truth all along but couldn't prove it. She made their cases solvable. She turned what had been dead-end investigations into prosecutable crimes with evidence that couldn't be disputed. The jury saw all of this. They saw the doorbell footage of Mitchell at Danielle's door. They saw his aggressive posture, his refusal to identify himself, his countdown threat. They saw Danielle's calm responses, asking reasonable questions. They saw Mitchell walk away when he realized she was on the phone with his supervisor. Then they saw the database searches showing Danielle's name and address. They saw the photos of her building. They saw the notes about her schedule. They saw Mitchell's journal entry about targeting healthcare workers because they work long hours and come home exhausted. They saw the pattern. Mitchell had identified Danielle as a target, had researched her, had planned his approach, had shown up at her door late at night when he knew she would be alone and tired, had tried to intimidate his way inside using threats and false claims about a disturbance call. The only thing that stopped him was Danielle's refusal to open the door. And then they saw the recordings from his previous victims. The prosecutors warned them that the content would be disturbing, gave them the option to leave the courtroom if they needed to. None of the jurors left. They sat and watched and listened to Mitchell's own recordings of his own crimes. Several jurors cried, wanted to take a break, but they all came back and they all stayed because they understood the importance of seeing the complete picture. When the prosecution rested, there was no doubt about the verdict. The evidence was too comprehensive, too documented, too impossible to explain away. The defense put on a briefcase. Character witnesses who said Mitchell had been a good officer, a good colleague, a good neighbor. Family members who said he was a good father and husband. But those testimonies rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Being a good father to your own children doesn't make you less guilty of terrorizing other people's daughters. Being a good neighbor to some people doesn't erase stalking and assaulting other people. Having some good qualities doesn't balance out being a serial predator. The jury came back in 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Every single charge. Mitchell's wife collapsed in the back of the courtroom. His attorney put his head in his hands. Mitchell himself showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead like he couldn't process what was happening. But the victims in the courtroom, Danielle and Jennifer and Maria and Alexis, they held hands. They cried because finally, after months or years of trauma and fear and wondering if anyone would believe them, they had been believed. They had been heard. Justice was possible after all. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later brought everything full circle. All 5 victims gave impact statements. They talked about the trauma, the PTSD, the nightmares, the fear of being alone, the difficulty trusting anyone, the therapy bills, the relationships that fell apart, the jobs they lost because they couldn't function, the life plans that got derailed. But they also talked about resilience, about healing, about refusing to let Mitchell define their futures, about finding strength in community and therapy and the support of people who believe them. Jennifer's statement focused on the long-term impacts. He didn't just assault me that night. He stole my sense of safety. For months, I was afraid to be alone in my own apartment, afraid to answer the door, afraid of every police siren I heard. I moved 3 times trying to feel safe again. I quit my job because I couldn't focus. I pushed away my friends and family because I couldn't explain what had happened without breaking down. She paused, looked at Mitchell directly. But I'm not going to let you win. I'm in therapy. I'm rebuilding my life. I'm speaking out so other victims know they're not alone. You took a lot from me, but you don't get to take my future. Maria's statement was shorter, but equally powerful. She talked about the physical and emotional toll. about dropping out of grad school, about the mountain of medical and therapy bills, about the panic attacks that made it hard to leave her apartment. But she also talked about finding purpose in advocacy. I volunteer with a victims' rights organization now. I help other survivors navigate the reporting process. I make sure they know it's not their fault, that they deserve to be believed. And every person I help, that's taking power back from you. That's turning something horrible into something meaningful. Alexis focused on her children. I have 2 daughters. They watched me struggle to recover from what you did. They saw me crying. They saw me scared. They saw me having nightmares. And I had to explain to them why Mommy was afraid of police officers now. Why we couldn't just automatically trust someone with a badge. She looked at the judge, but I also showed them resilience. I showed them that you can survive something terrible and come out the other side. I showed them that speaking up matters even when it's hard. I showed them that justice is possible if you're brave enough to fight for it. So yes, he hurt me. But my daughters learned something valuable from watching me heal. They learned that strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and speaking up anyway. The 2 additional victims who came forward after Danielle's evidence broke the case also gave statements. They were brief. Focused on gratitude to Danielle for making their cases solvable. Focused on the relief of finally being believed. Danielle's statement was different. She hadn't been physically assaulted. She was there as a witness, not a victim. But the prosecutor asked her to speak anyway, because her actions had made everything else possible. Danielle stood at the podium and spoke directly to the other victims. I don't pretend to understand what you went through. I know that what happened to me is nothing compared to what happened to you. But I want you to know something. You were telling the truth all along. The system failed you, but you were telling the truth. And I hope that having this evidence, having this conviction, gives you some measure of peace. She turned to address the courtroom more broadly. I want people to understand that what I did wasn't special. I asked questions. I documented. I called 911. Anyone could do that. Anyone should do that. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Don't open the door just because someone has a badge. Ask questions. Verify. Protect yourself. She paused. And I want to say something to anyone watching who's been assaulted by someone in authority, who's been told they won't be believed, who's been scared to report. You deserve to be believed. You deserve justice. It might take time. It might be hard. But don't give up. Speak up. Document everything. Find support. Because predators rely on silence. They rely on victims being too scared to report. Every person who speaks up makes it a little bit easier for the next person. The judge listened to all of it, took notes, asked clarifying questions. Then he delivered the sentence. 38 years. Mitchell will be 68 before he was eligible for parole. The courtroom erupted. Victims sobbing with relief. Victim advocates hugging each other. Mitchell's family devastated but silent. Mitchell himself being led away in handcuffs, still showing no emotion, still not acknowledging what he had done. Outside the courthouse, the prosecutor held a press conference. She talked about the importance of the doorbell camera evidence, about how technology had made the case solvable, about how victims should always document and report, about how the system could work when there was evidence to support victims' accounts. But she also acknowledged the failures. The fact that 3 women had reported before Danielle's incident and their cases went nowhere. The fact that Mitchell's database searches should have been flagged earlier. The fact that better oversight and monitoring could have stopped him sooner. The press conference became a national news story. Not just the local news, but CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. The story had everything. Police misconduct, technology catching a predator, brave victims speaking out, systemic reforms needed. Law enforcement agencies around the country started reviewing their database access policies, started implementing better monitoring systems, started training officers on recognizing signs of predatory behavior in colleagues. Doorbell camera companies saw sales spike. Home security companies used the case in their marketing. If Danielle Moore had opened that door, if she hadn't had a camera recording, the outcome would have been very different. Civil rights organizations used the case to teach Know Your Rights workshops. You have the right to ask for badge numbers. You have a right to call 911 to verify. You have the right to refuse entry without a warrant unless there's an emergency. You have the right to document your interactions with law enforcement. Victim advocacy groups use the case to encourage reporting. Even if you can't identify your attacker, even if you don't think you have enough evidence, report. Because your report might be the piece that makes another case solvable. Your report might establish a pattern. Your report matters. The impact rippled outward in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. 6 months after Mitchell's sentencing, the Seattle Police Department released data on their reforms. The Independent Review Board had handled 23 allegations of sexual misconduct by officers. 12 were substantiated. All 12 officers were fired or resigned. 3 faced criminal charges. The database monitoring system flagged 42 officers for suspicious searches in its first 6 months. Most were innocent mistakes or poor documentation that could be explained. But 7 were conducting searches with no legitimate purpose. All 7 were investigated. 4 fired. 2 resigned. 1 was criminally charged for stalking. The body camera requirement led to increased documentation of police-civilian interactions. It also led to 3 cases where officers' own cameras captured them violating procedures. All 3 were disciplined. 1 was fired. The mandatory training on recognizing predatory behavior led to 2 instances where officers reported colleagues for suspicious behavior toward female civilians. Both reports led to investigations. 1 was unfounded. 1 led to an officer being placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The reforms weren't perfect. They didn't catch everyone, but they created accountability where none had existed before. They sent a message that misconduct would be taken seriously, that victims would be believed and supported, that the badge didn't protect predators anymore.